How does a woman become a legend of violence when all she ever fought against was the world itself? Tonight, we reopen the forgotten file of Bessie Moncrieff, a name that once echoed through the police courts of London, a name that frightened constables, exasperated magistrates, and saddened chaplains. You're listening to Filed Lives. Tell me where you are this evening, perhaps walking or resting beneath a soft lamp. Subscribe if you wish, and stay with me as we travel back to the century of gaslight and rain. There, between the echo of carriage wheels and the hiss of alehouse doors, lived a woman who could never keep still. Her story is written not in letters or memoirs, but in charge sheets, press columns, and the weary words of men who arrested her again and again. She struck constables, broke windows, and once tried to set fire to her own bedding. They called her the most violent woman in London. Oh, but beneath those headlines lies another life, quieter, lonelier, and infinitely more human. A woman born in Cornwall around 1858, whose name changed spelling as often as her fortunes. Moncrieff, 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 all pointing to the same drifting soul. She left almost no record of herself except through punishment. Yet across 40 years of arrests, fines, and imprisonment, fragments appear. Her voice, sometimes defiant, sometimes pleading, the small mercies of chaplains and police matrons, the half-remembered promise of home by the sea. And so we begin, not in a courtroom or cell, but in the green silence of Cornwall, where the story of London's terrible woman first took breath. In the spring census of 1861, somewhere along the coast of Cornwall, the name Bessie may have appeared once, a child of 2 or 3, sharing a cottage roof with the smell of salt and coal dust. The record itself is uncertain. So many rural names were scrawled half-legibly by enumerators who never thought they were recording a life that London would one day judge. Still, we can imagine the smallness of that beginning. A home that the newspapers would later call respectable, a good home to go to. The Cornwall of Bessie's childhood was already changing. Tin mines were closing, and the younger generation looked eastward to the capital, chasing service work or factory pay. The sound of the sea, constant, persuasive, carried rumors of the city's possibilities. For a girl of limited means, London was both miracle and threat, a place to start again, and to lose oneself completely. We know almost nothing of how she grew up, yet the records of her later life preserve a ghostly echo of that early place. In court, she would say, "I have a good home in Cornwall to go to." She said it in 1882, again in 1885, and still in 1899, long after anyone there might have waited for her. Those words, repeated across decades of police reports, sound less like evidence and more like prayer, a line she told herself when the walls of a cell grew close. Cornwall lingered in her like a memory of decency, a talisman against what she became. Perhaps her parents were tradespeople or small farmers. Perhaps there was church on Sundays, laundry on Mondays, and the thin smell of kelp and iron in the wind. Every court record insists that she once had friends who sent her money, who begged her to come home. That connection, that anchor to a place of belonging, gives her tragedy its shape. It reminds us that no one begins as a headline. By the 1870s, tens of thousands had left Cornwall, taking the new rail line northward to Paddington Station, where London's haze opened like another world. Service girls, laundry workers, barmaids. They filled the West End's kitchens and lodging houses. The city needed their labor and devoured it. The wages were low, the temptations many, and for a woman alone, each evening's safety depended on luck. Somewhere in those years, Bessie arrived, perhaps no older than 20, carrying a small trunk and the accent of the far west. Her world changed from open fields to narrow streets lined with public houses. Piccadilly, Sloane Street, Brompton Road, all glittering with gaslight and music. In this new geography of desire and danger, she would find both work and ruin. The pattern of such migration was common. Women sought service or bar work, met men who promised companionship, and learned that alcohol softened the ache of fatigue. Victorian London drank constantly. Gin, ale, brandy, and drink became both social currency and escape. For women, it was a forbidden pleasure and a fatal weakness. A drunken man was pitied, a drunken woman condemned. It was within that moral double standard that Bessie's name first entered the papers. The press would later call her of good appearance and respectably dressed, codes meaning she was not destitute, not yet. But behind those polite phrases hid a new urban sickness, habitual drunkenness, what the law soon defined as moral, not medical. The police court became her diary. Still, in 1858, when she was born, none of that was written. The Cornish child could not have foreseen the narrow stone cells that awaited her. She would grow up through the 1860s as Britain's empire swelled abroad and its cities hardened within. By the time she reached adulthood, the workhouse loomed as the safety net for any woman who faltered. And yet, through every report, there remains an undertone of vitality, a stubborn flame that refused to go out. Even as magistrates called her incorrigible, constables described her as good-looking, well-spoken, able to read and write. Those fragments suggest a woman with education, wit, and a memory of gentler beginnings. Perhaps that is what made her defiance so unmanageable. She knew what respectability felt like, and the loss of it stung. When we think of Bessie's Cornwall, we might picture the shoreline at dusk, the tide pulling away, the gulls calling low. The same sea that once promised escape would, decades later, remain the unreachable horizon of her mind. Each time she told a magistrate she had a good home to go to, she was really speaking to herself, invoking a vanished world where she was still somebody's daughter. The journey from there to London's Vine Street police station spans only a few lines in the surviving record, yet within it lies the story of a society that failed to see the person behind the offense. The girl from Cornwall, with blue eyes and fair hair, boarded a train toward opportunity and instead found a labyrinth of gin shops, narrow beds, and indifferent law. As the 1880s opened, the newspapers filled with stories of fallen women, public inebriates, and female rogues. They were easy moral lessons for a public eager to believe that poverty was self-inflicted. In that chorus of condemnation, one voice would rise again and again. Bessie Moncrieff, aged 25, charged at Vine Street, charged at Westminster, charged everywhere the lights burned late. But that part of her story belongs to another night. For now, we leave her standing on the railway platform, a young woman on the edge of the unknown, watching the smoke of the departing train drift into the sea wind. What happens when the promise of a new life collides with the walls of authority? We will begin there, in London, 1882, where the first entry in her long and sorrowful record was written. The railway from Cornwall reached London in a slow exhalation of steam. For those who had never left their villages, the city seemed to expand forever, a gray ocean of rooftops and sound. It was the late 1870s, and for a woman of 20 alone, London was both sanctuary and snare. The platform at Paddington Station smelled of coal and rain. Porters shouted. Hansom cabs rattled away toward Bayswater and Marylebone. Somewhere in that restless tide stepped Bessie Moncrieff, another face among thousands seeking work, adventure, or simply a place to exist. What did she feel that first night? The newspapers will never tell us. They record her crimes, not her awe. Yet the world she entered was alive with contradictions. Vast wealth beside extreme want. From Piccadilly to Chelsea, from Knightsbridge to Soho, London glittered and stank. The air carried perfume and refuse in equal measure. At dusk, the pavement shone like mirrors under the gas lamps, and women's laughter rose from the doorways of public houses. For a few coins, one could forget almost anything. Most likely, Bessie found employment first in service, a maid, perhaps, or bar attendant in one of the West End taverns. Many young women from the provinces did. They worked 12-hour shifts, sleeping in attic rooms, rising before dawn to scrub steps or polish mirrors. The money was small, the expectations rigid. Employers dismissed servants for lateness, cheek, or the slightest suspicion of drink. Respectability was a fragile currency, and once lost, it was almost impossible to buy back. In the early years, she must have tried to keep hold of it. Some later reports describe her as respectably dressed and of good appearance. Those were not compliments, they were warnings. They told the reader that this was not a woman from the gutter, but one who had fallen from grace, and therefore, in Victorian eyes, more culpable. It was around this time that London itself was shifting. The old gin palaces of the 1830s had given way to a newer, brighter kind of drinking world. Plate glass windows, polished mahogany bars, chandeliers reflected in long mirrors. Taverns became theaters of escape. Men in uniform and laborers in clay boots rubbed shoulders with shopgirls and seamstresses. A woman could enter as a customer, not merely as a servant, and that changed everything, and ruined many. For women like Bessie, drink offered brief agency. A glass of gin dulled hunger, eased loneliness, made laughter possible. It also made defiance possible. Drunkenness, for a woman, was not just a lapse. It was rebellion against every rule of propriety. The state called it a vice. The courts called it crime. But to the drinker herself, it was often the only act of self-determination left. By 1880, London's police courts, Marlborough Street, Westminster, Marylebone, and Worship Street, were processing hundreds of drunkenness cases each week. Most were minor, fined or dismissed. But every so often, a name would appear again and again until it became familiar to reporters. Bessie Moncrieff's name would be one of those. Yet before the notoriety, there was the ordinary life, the cheap lodging house, the narrow iron bed, the smell of frying fat and wet wool. Perhaps she shared rooms with other women, all trying to stay afloat on the same small wages. The city could be kind to youth and cruel to anyone past it. Once a woman's reputation slipped, even slightly, her options collapsed. No employer wanted a servant with a taste for drink. No lodging house wanted a woman known to the police. Respectability was not merely moral, it was economic survival. By the autumn of 1882, Bessie was 25. Whatever stability she had managed was faltering. The Yorkshire Grey public house at the corner of Piccadilly was a lively and noisy place, a spot where laborers, cabmen, and shopgirls gathered after work. That night, the 22nd of September, the city air was damp, the streets slick from rain. Inside the pub, laughter was loud, ale flowing freely. When she was ordered to leave, she refused. That small act, the simple refusal to move, marked the beginning of her long collision with the law. Constable John Field tried to escort her outside, but she resisted, her anger drawing a crowd. He took her, struggling, to Vine Street Police Station, a short walk away. Inside the cell, her despair revealed itself in silence. When the constable turned his back, she used a scarf to strangle herself. It was not the last time she would try. The officer found her black in the face and insensible. The report, printed in the Daily News, called it an attempted suicide. She was charged, not saved. At the hearing, the magistrate, Mr. Mansfield, listened to statements from the jailer and inspector. They called her one of the most troublesome women the police have to deal with. She said only that she was sorry. He remanded her for further inquiry, an early sign of the weary compassion she would elicit from courtrooms for 40 years. We might pause here, at that first recorded fall. What loneliness must lead a person to such an act inside a police cell? And what must it mean to awaken again? Not in a hospital, but in the dock, facing the same uniformed men who had cut her down. The documents preserve no answer. They simply move on to the next line of procedure. Yet in that small space of silence, the story begins to open. This was no hardened criminal, not yet. She was a woman overwhelmed by the city's noise, by its endless judgments, by her own isolation. To the papers, she was a curiosity, another unruly female. But behind those clipped reports lies a cry for help that no one seemed to hear. After the hearing, she was likely taken to Westminster prison for a few nights' confinement before release. Perhaps the air outside felt heavy, unfamiliar. She had crossed an invisible boundary. Once a prisoner, always watched. The next arrest would come sooner, the sentence longer. Still, when she was asked in court where she came from, she answered softly, "From Cornwall, sir. I have a good home to go to." Those words would follow her like a refrain through every decade to come, half truth, half hope, repeated until they lost meaning. As we close this chapter, imagine her walking back through Piccadilly under the gas lamps, her breath visible in the cool night air, her heart beating against the noise of the city that had already decided who she was. A woman walking alone in London was always being watched, by men, by police, by judgment itself. But who watched over her? Who saw the child of Cornwall beneath the defiance? In the next part, we will follow her to the Brompton Road, where a letter from home, trembling in her hands, offered one more chance of rescue, and the faint promise of redemption that would never quite arrive. The night of her first arrest had ended with the slow clanging of iron doors and the thud of boots in a corridor. The noise would follow her into sleep for years. But when she was released, the city still glittered as though nothing had happened. London rarely remembered the people it punished. It turned over its days like the pages of a newspaper, one scandal after another, and only those whose names reappeared again and again became something like familiar. Bessie Moncrieff's name would soon be one of those. For a few months after September 1882, she seems to have vanished from the record. Perhaps she tried to keep steady work again. Perhaps she managed to stay sober for a time. The police court reporters, who had already noted her once, forgot her until December. But that winter, her story re-emerged, printed in the Chelsea News and General Advertiser, a small local paper whose columns rarely stretched beyond the neighborhood. On the 2nd of December, 1882, the paper described a respectably dressed young woman named Bessie Moncrieff, charged at Westminster Police Court for being drunk and disorderly in Brompton Road. That phrase, respectably dressed, appears often in Victorian reporting. It was a code of class and shame meant to assure the reader that this woman was not of the lowest order, but had fallen from it. To be drunk in rags was expected. To be drunk in a good coat was disgraceful. According to 2 constables, they had found her shouting in the street and urged her to go home. She refused, argued, then struck one of them in the face. In court, she denied it all. "I had a little drink," she admitted, "but I did not cause a disturbance." She said the officers bore a grudge against her because she had complained about their behavior on an earlier occasion. Then, in a moment that startled even the reporters, she produced a letter. She handed it to the magistrate. Mr. Partridge, with trembling hands, saying it was from her parents. They were asking her to come home to Cornwall. The magistrate read the letter silently. We do not know its words, only his reaction. He said softly, "It is a very nice letter to receive from your parents." In that small phrase lies an entire world, the surprise of tenderness inside a court of punishment. Instead of sentencing her, he remanded her for the chaplain to visit and report on her case. For once, the machinery of law hesitated. It tried to understand. We can imagine the chaplain, black-robed, mild-voiced, speaking to her in the echoing passage of Westminster Police Court. These men believed in redemption through discipline, through prayer and placement in a home for fallen women. There she would be surrounded by scripture, temperance, and supervision. It was a fragile alternative to prison, one that required obedience she did not yet know how to give. For a few days, perhaps weeks, she would have lived in suspense. half fearful, half hopeful, waiting to hear whether she would be sent to such a refuge. The newspaper simply notes that she was remanded for the chaplain's inquiry. Then her name disappears again. The silence that follows is almost tender. 2 years pass before the record finds her again. That gap suggests something. Perhaps the chaplain's influence worked for a time, or perhaps she returned home to Cornwall as the letter urged. We cannot know. But the fact that her next appearance does not come until late 1884 implies a fragile interlude of calm, a small reprieve in a life that would otherwise be measured by arrests. During those quiet years, London changed around her. The West End grew brighter, noisier. Public houses multiplied. The police presence thickened. New laws on drunken and disorderly conduct filled the prisons faster than they could be emptied. Women's rescue societies flourished, offering spiritual reform for those who would submit to authority. It was a system built on the assumption that a woman's waywardness could be prayed out of her. But the women themselves, once inside, often fled. They found the moral lectures and locked doors unbearable, the charity conditional, the pity condescending. Freedom, even the desperate freedom of the street, felt more honest. For many, like Bessie, these attempts at rescue ended not in salvation but in another charge sheet. When she reappears in November 1884, she is older by only 2 years, yet the tone of the reports has changed. The same Chelsea News calls her exceedingly violent. The phrase repeats across papers, a new label attached to her name. Whatever she endured between those years, it hardened her. It is easy to judge her from the distance of time, to see only the pattern of relapse and crime. But consider the world she moved through. Nights in overcrowded lodgings, hunger that dulled the mind, men who offered warmth for a price, and the unending sound of other people's laughter behind closed doors. Respectability was not a moral state. It was a possession, and she had lost it. Still, that letter, the one read aloud in the Westminster court, remained a pivot in her story. It is the only surviving trace of family affection, the only time the world of home reached out to touch the world of punishment. Every later newspaper, when it described her, recalled the same detail, that she had a good home to go to in Cornwall. Whether she ever saw that home again is doubtful, but the idea of it never left her speech. Even in her last years, arrested at 60 for drunkenness in Hyde Park, she would tell the magistrate the same thing. It had become a litany against despair. In the soft flicker of imagination, we can picture her on the night after that hearing, leaving the courthouse by the side door, the chaplain's promise still echoing in her ears. Perhaps she walked down toward the King's Road, the lights of Chelsea reflected in puddles, her hands shaking from cold or drink or both. Somewhere in her pocket lay the folded letter, the handwriting of her parents, the faint scent of another life. She might have held it once more before sleep, tracing the words as if they could summon home itself. But London has a way of swallowing even its own promises. The streets that offered shelter also offered temptation. The same city that pretended to save her was already waiting to condemn her again. When we next find her, 2 years later, it is near Strutton Ground, Westminster, and she is once again in the hands of the police, this time with a handkerchief knotted around her throat, defying anyone to stop her. The letter from Cornwall will not be mentioned again. Only the phrase it contained, "Come home," will survive, carried like a whisper through every cell she will ever inhabit. By the time she reappeared in the newspapers, 2 years had passed since the letter from Cornwall had been read aloud in Westminster Court. The chaplain's intervention had faded into another forgotten kindness, and London had continued to turn around her, indifferent as ever. The year was 1884, and the city's police cells were as full as its streets. It was a Sunday morning in mid-November, cold and raw, when Constable A.T.B. found her again, this time in Strutton Ground, a narrow market street near Westminster Abbey, known for its traders and taverns. She was shouting, swearing, staggering, her voice echoing off the brick walls. He arrested her with difficulty, wrestling her toward Rochester Row Police Station, where the light of dawn fell across rows of empty cells. Inside, she fought like someone possessed. The constable described her later as exceedingly violent. When he returned a few minutes after locking her in, he found her collapsed on the floor, a handkerchief twisted tight around her neck. He removed it, set her head on a pillow, went to call his inspector, and when he came back, she had tied another. The newspapers wrote that she was found black in the face, quite insensible. The official term was attempted suicide, a criminal charge. But beneath that phrase lay despair, the silent, nameless kind that gathers at the bottom of a life. When she regained consciousness, she said she would do it again, even if she had to tear her clothes to make the cord. Her words were printed, line by line, across 2 newspapers, as though the public needed to see what defiance looked like in female form. On Monday, 17th of November, 1884, she was brought before Mr. Marsham at the Westminster Court. The record of that hearing shows how small the machinery of mercy could be. The magistrate, recalling her earlier remand under Mr. Partridge, followed the same pattern. He postponed judgment, asking the chaplain to speak with her once more. There was still, perhaps, a belief that she could be reclaimed. It was not unusual for courts to pause in this way. The chaplains were intermediaries between punishment and pity. They visited the cells, spoke gently, and arranged placements in charitable homes, rescue shelters, penitentiaries, or temperance refuges, where women were offered instruction, prayer, and work. Most lasted a few weeks, some fled within days. But for the magistrates, this process offered a small moral reassurance that they were not simply jailing the poor, but attempting reform. The reports from that winter are sparse, but the outcome of the chaplain's visit appears in early December. On the 1st of December, 1884, Bessie was brought up again before Mr. Partridge, the same magistrate who had read her parents' letter 2 years before. The chaplain had found a place willing to take her, a home, as the newspaper phrased it, that would receive her. We do not know its name. It might have been one of the Church of England temperance homes, or perhaps a branch of the female mission to the fallen in Westminster. These were modest institutions run by clergymen's wives or retired matrons, where women were confined by moral obligation rather than by law. They rose at dawn, attended prayer, mended linen, and learned to speak quietly. There was bread and tea, a little warmth, a bed that was not in a cell. When asked in court if she was willing to go, she said she was, and for that simple assent, she was discharged. The magistrate recorded her release for that purpose. For a brief time, then, the machinery of compassion seemed to function. She was sent from the dock into the care of those who promised redemption. But redemption requires stillness, and Bessie never possessed it. We can imagine her first night in that home, the beds arranged in rows, the smell of soap and starch, the sound of whispered prayer. Around her lay other women, each with a story almost identical. Servants dismissed for drink, wives abandoned, daughters shamed. They were called inmates, though they had not been convicted of any crime. Their salvation depended on obedience. To speak out, to question, to laugh too loud was to risk expulsion. For someone like Bessie, whose instinct was defiance, the place must have felt like another prison. Yet there might have been moments of quiet comfort. Hot tea, a hymn sung before sleep, the sense of being clean and safe for the first time in months. Then, as always, something shifted. The reports fall silent again until the next year, 1885, when her name reappears at the Westminster Police Court. Whatever promise the chaplain's home had offered, it had not held her long. By the autumn of 1885, she was once more in the public houses of the West End. The Feathers Tavern on Great Chapel Street was her undoing that September. The landlord said she entered sober, but was plied with drink by others. When she became loud and used most filthy language, she was ejected. In fury, she returned and smashed an expensive pane of embossed plate glass with her umbrella. 50 shillings worth of damage, a serious sum for the time. This time, the case was prosecuted not just by the landlord, but by a representative of the Victuallers' Protection Society, a trade association for London's publicans that specialized in prosecuting troublesome customers. The hearing was almost theatrical. The prosecutor called her a pest to the neighborhood. Bessie stood in the dock, still insisting she had been provoked. "Everyone takes advantage of me," she said. "I have a good home in Cornwall to go to." The magistrate, this time recorded as Mr. Danecourt, had lost patience. He sentenced her to 6 weeks' hard labor. It was a turning point. The revolving door of remand and rescue had closed. She would no longer be treated as a soul to be saved, but as a nuisance to be contained. Hard labor meant rising before dawn, wearing coarse prison dress, working the crank or treadwheel for hours. It was punishment designed to crush the will. For women, it was also moral theater, proof to the public that the state would discipline female vice as harshly as male crime. Still, within that sentence lies a cruel irony. 6 weeks of order and routine might have been the closest thing to rehabilitation she ever received. The prison diet, the absence of drink, the sleep, all might have steadied her briefly. But the moment she stepped outside again, London would reclaim her. The assistant jailer later testified that by 1885 she had already been convicted 18 times at that court alone. The number would double, then triple, then grow beyond counting. But numbers tell nothing of the woman herself, only of the system's failure to imagine her as anything more than a case. When the prison gates opened that winter, Bessie walked out into the fog of Westminster Bridge Road, a free woman once more, her sentence served, her name already inked on another page of history. The chaplains had tried, the magistrates had tried, the homes of charity had closed their doors as quickly as they opened them, and so began the next chapter of her life. The slow transformation from troublesome woman to legend of unruliness. In the spring that followed, her defiance would make her infamous. She would strike a constable across the face in front of a crowd, be thrown out of the very court that tried her, and shout words that would echo in print from London to the Channel Islands. But before that moment, there was still a trace of light in her story. The faint, vanishing hope that someone might yet find the child who once received a letter from home. When the gates of Westminster Prison closed behind her, the air must have felt enormous. 6 weeks of confinement left the world strangely bright. The fog rolled along the Thames, and the sound of hooves on wet cobblestones echoed through her chest like a heartbeat. Freedom, for Bessie Moncrieff, was always a fragile thing, clear at first, then fading into the same familiar noise of London. She was around 28 now, still described by reporters as good-looking and well-spoken. The police knew her face too well. To them, she was not an individual, but a pattern that repeated. A woman found drunk, violent, resisting arrest, promising reform, then returning. Each new case added a line to her growing legend. By 1886, the constables of the West End could identify her from half a street away. In those years, London was restless. The Westminster courts overflowed with cases of petty disorder, each one a small note in the vast orchestration of poverty. The city's population was nearing 4 million. Public houses outnumbered churches. For women on the margins, drink was both comfort and protest. A man could stagger home from the pub and be forgiven. A woman who did the same was treated as a threat to public order itself. By the spring of 1887, Bessie had already been before the magistrates more than 24 times. The assistant jailer, Mr. Saunders, kept count. Each time she appeared, he would step forward to recite her record, as though reading the verses of a tragic litany: drunkenness, assault, willful damage. The repetition hardened her image in the public mind. She became a case, not a person. On Wednesday, 9th March 1887, the scene that sealed her notoriety unfolded. Not in the streets, but inside the court itself. The Jersey Express and several London papers carried the same headline: "A violent woman ejected from Westminster Police Court." That morning, the court had been crowded with petty cases: pickpockets, vagrants, children caught stealing coal. Among them stood Bessie, though she had no business there. The reports say she was drunk, muttering, disturbing the proceedings. When the clerk told her to be silent, she laughed. When the constable approached to remove her, she struck him squarely in the face. The blow was so sudden that the crowd gasped. Even the magistrate, Mr. Partridge, looked up sharply from his papers. Constable Scott testified that the strike was as violent a blow as she could give. Partridge asked if it hurt. The constable replied that it did. Bessie, unrepentant, shouted across the dock, "I wish I had hurt you a bit more." That line, reprinted in every paper, fixed her public identity. She was no longer merely troublesome. She was dangerous, a woman who hit back. A second officer, Tom Moore, told the court she had entered the courtroom intoxicated and refused to leave. When asked what was known of her, the assistant jailer again stepped forward. "She has been charged no fewer than 27 times, he said, "and has twice been sent to homes, but each time absconded within days." Partridge sighed. "What have you to say?" She looked at him without blinking. Nothing. The sentence was 3 months' imprisonment with hard labor for assaulting the constable. When she heard the words, she clutched the rail of the dock and refused to move. It took 2 jailers to drag her down the steps while she cursed them. The papers printed that she used most disgusting language as she was led away. From that moment on, her name carried weight. She was Bessie Moncrieff, the pest of Westminster. 4 months later, in July 1887, she was free again. The city was in the grip of summer heat. Dust and noise filled the air. At 2 a.m. on the 14th of July, screams echoed through Charlotte Street in Marylebone. "Police! Murder!" A constable ran toward the sound and found her there, bruised, furious, claiming she had been robbed of her purse by a man who had lured her into a cab. She said he had struck her and fled. The officer, observing that she was drunk and shouting obscenities, arrested her instead. In court before Mr. Mansfield, she admitted, "Well, I had some drink." He fined her 5 shillings for drunkenness. She smiled and said, "Thank you very much." The courtroom laughed. That laughter is cruel to read now. The easy amusement of people watching a woman's slow undoing. But to them, she was entertainment. A recurring comic figure in the pages of the evening press. Every week the same: drunken woman, outrageous scene, inevitable fall. By September, she had moved from Pimlico lodgings to a house in Carrington Street, Mayfair, giving her age as 36, nearly 10 years older than in the first reports. The inconsistency itself became part of the myth. Bessie could be any age, any name, any face that fit the story of the incorrigible woman. That autumn, her defiance reached new theatrical heights. At the Feathers Tavern, she shouted that she would make them pay, then hurled her umbrella against the window glass until it shattered. In court, the prosecutor from the Victualers' Society repeated his line from the year before: "This woman is a pest to the neighborhood." Pest. The word stuck. For the police, it meant a repeat offender. For the public, it meant a spectacle. For Bessie, it was a kind of grim immortality. We might wonder what she felt as she heard the label repeated, in headlines, in court, in whispers outside the cell. Did she resist it or wear it like armor? Some prisoners become smaller with every sentence. Others grow defiant, drawing strength from their own notoriety. By late 1887, she was both, shrinking and swelling at once, caught between exhaustion and rage. Each conviction carved another piece away from her, yet each also made her harder to erase. She began to speak her own name like a challenge. When a gentleman in Knightsbridge tried to shake her off, she struck him across the hat and declared, "Take that, I am Bessie Moncrieff." It was bravado, but also recognition. If the world would not remember her kindness, it would remember her defiance. The records from that winter mention bruises on her face, torn clothes, the police strapping her to a wheeled ambulance because she fought so violently. She told the court she had just been released from Hanwell Asylum, that she had been in Banstead and Broadmoor before that, a chain of institutions whose names sounded like tolling bells. The magistrate, Mr. Danecourt, sighed. "You are indeed a terrible woman." She smiled, saying, "I can do the 6 weeks on my head." The court laughed again. The headlines did too, but beneath the laughter ran a deeper current, the first hints of mental collapse, the erosion of the line between fury and illness. The same city that had mocked her would soon confine her not for vice, but for madness. By the end of 1887, her reputation was sealed. She was no longer the servant girl from Cornwall, nor even the habitual drunkard. She was the woman London had decided to fear, a mirror held up to its own hypocrisy. Punished for breaking rules that men wrote for her, and applauded when she broke them spectacularly. The next chapter of her life would take her beyond the ordinary police courts, into the shadowed corridors of asylums and prisons. The name Bessie Moncrieff would appear in reports from Broadmoor, Banstead, and Hanwell, her story dissolving into the institutional rhythm of confinement and release. But before that descent, there remains one more moment to witness. A night in Hyde Park, where the moonlight caught the edges of her defiance, and the law, once again, turned its gaze upon her. The moon was thin that January night in 1888, a sliver of silver hanging above Hyde Park Corner. The city was restless, even in the cold. Carriages rolled past the gates, the gas lamps flickered in the wind, and the pavement gleamed like wet glass. A policeman on patrol outside St. George's Hospital heard raised voices, then the sharp clatter of heels. When he turned the corner, he found her again, small, furious, and impossible to ignore. Bessie Moncrieff had been ejected from the hospital, though no one could later explain why she was there. The constable's report said she had thrown herself to the ground, screaming and swearing, refusing to move. Her breath smelled of gin. When asked to go home, she cursed the officer and the world alike. He arrested her on the spot for disorderly conduct. It was a familiar script now, one she could perform almost from memory. In court before Mr. Partridge, she offered a defense that was both tragic and sincere. A gentleman, she said, had drugged her. "I recollect nothing of what occurred at the hospital." Her words might once have provoked sympathy, but not now. The magistrate's patience had been worn thin by repetition. The assistant jailer stepped forward and gave the updated tally. 30 convictions at this court alone. Partridge fined her 5 shillings. Bessie, ever composed, thanked him politely. "Thank you very much," she said. The laughter in the courtroom was described as general. It is an awful sound to imagine, that wave of laughter rising above a woman's attempt to keep her dignity. Yet this was Victorian London, a society that found comedy in female misfortune. The police court was not merely a place of judgment, it was a stage. The crowd came for entertainment, and Bessie had become part of the daily performance. Still, beneath the caricature, the documents leave small traces of her humanity. One constable described her as pale and weary, another as respectably dressed, but troubled. The jailer noted that she was generally quiet in prison, though liable to outbursts. These fragments suggest a woman living at the edge of exhaustion, her temper a spark against the endless dullness of confinement. The newspapers, of course, told it differently. To them, she was the most incorrigible of Westminster's female offenders. Their headlines grew sharper with every arrest. A terrible woman again before the court. Miss Moncrieff's 31st appearance. Habitual drunkard defies the police. The spelling of her name changed with every issue. Moncrieff, 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 as though even the typesetters had grown weary of precision. And yet, if we read carefully, something shifts around this time. The tone of the reports darkens. The laughter that once greeted her name begins to sound uneasy. There is pity now, faint but real, among the lines of mockery. By mid-1888, the city was alive with stories of crime. The newspapers filled with the horrors of Whitechapel, the unsolved murders that would forever mark that year. Against that backdrop of male violence, the spectacle of one woman's self-destruction seemed almost domestic, even safe. But Bessie's defiance, her refusal to behave, carried its own kind of threat. She broke the rules of gender as well as law. She spoke back when women were meant to be silent, resisted when they were meant to yield, and made a spectacle of her own suffering. Her next known case in September 1887 had already shown how fragile her standing was. That night, she had been found at a lodging house in Carrington Street, Mayfair, accused of causing annoyance by ringing the bell after being refused entry. She told the court she had been invited by a male lodger, her friend, and was merely trying to see him. When the man appeared to confirm her story, the magistrate discharged the case. It was one of the very few times she was believed. The episode might have ended there, but the press could not resist commentary. The Westminster Chronicle noted the irony. It is not often that Miss Moncrieff leaves court triumphant. Even her innocence was treated as amusement. To live in that kind of scrutiny was to lose one's self. Every gesture became part of the legend. Even her voice, the way she spoke in court, alternately polite and venomous, was reported like dialogue from a play. When she said, "Everyone takes advantage of me," the phrase was printed not as pain but as spectacle. And yet, through it all, the faint echo of her origins persisted. Each time she faced the bench, she invoked the same phrase, "I have a good home in Cornwall to go to." The repetition of those words, year after year, suggests that she believed them even as they ceased to be true. Cornwall had become her imagined salvation, a place untouched by the city's judgments. It existed now only in memory. A spiritual geography she carried like a charm. There is an image that lingers from this period. Bessie leaving the courthouse at dusk, her hat askew, her shawl clutched around her shoulders. The street outside buzzes with carriages, the smell of coal smoke and fried onions drifting through the air. Somewhere, a newspaper boy shouts headlines, perhaps her own name among them. She would have walked toward Pimlico, where the cheap lodging houses stood, the soles of her boots thin, her breath visible in the evening air. Each time she was released, she stepped into the same circle: drink, disturbance, arrest, remorse, release. The system had no mechanism for healing, only for repetition. And she, in turn, had no way to step outside it. The police knew her by sight. The courts knew her by name. Escape was no longer possible. By the year's end, her age was printed as 36, a leap of nearly a decade in just a few months of reporting. It was as though the city itself had aged her, compressing the years of struggle into an accelerated decline. Her body could not have changed so fast, but her face, tired and lined, told another story. The records from early 1889 confirm the transformation. A headline in the Weekly Dispatch announced her 31st appearance. It recounted, almost with fascination, how she had set fire to her bedding at Millbank Prison, and how she had been sent home to Cornwall several times, but always returned. The paper concluded with chilling finality. Every effort has been made to reclaim her. It was true, in a sense. Every official mechanism of pity had been tried. The chaplain's visits, the rescue homes, the temperance missionaries, but all of it had been built on obedience, on submission to authority. Bessie had never been able to submit, not even to kindness. Her rebellion was instinctive, a survival reflex in a world that demanded she be grateful for control. As 1889 began, she was already sliding towards something darker. Longer sentences, harsher courts, and the first whispers of mental instability. The woman the newspapers called terrible was, by then, simply exhausted, a creature of habit and hunger, trapped inside the machinery of her own reputation. The laughter that once followed her out of court was quieter now, uneasy, as though London itself sensed that this story would not end with amusement. Next time, her trial would not be for drunkenness, but for felony. A jury would sit in judgment. The charge, theft and assault. The legend of London's most violent woman was about to be written in full. By the spring of 1889, the city that once laughed at Bessie Moncrieff had grown tired of her. The newspapers still printed her name, but now with a tone of finality, as if her story had reached its conclusion long before she did. She had become, in their words, a well-known figure of the Westminster police court, a description that meant notoriety more than familiarity. Even the police, who once spoke of her with irritation, now treated her with weary recognition. The record books listed her offenses like beads on a rosary: drunkenness, assault, willful damage, obscene language, attempted suicide. The same charges repeated until meaning itself wore thin. Then, in March of that year, she crossed a line that the courts could not ignore. The newspapers tell us it began, as so many of her cases did, with a disturbance in Warwick Square, Pimlico. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, and Bessie was shouting in the street that her collie dog had been stolen. When a constable tried to calm her, she struck the windows of the inspector's office with her bare fist, breaking the glass. "This is what I want," she shouted as they led her away. "When I get back to prison, I'll smash everything I can lay my hands on." She was fined and imprisoned again, but this time the sentence marked only the prelude to something larger. 2 months later, her name appeared not in the police court columns, but in the London County Sessions, a higher court reserved for indictable offenses. Theft, assault, and crimes the petty magistrates could not summarily punish. On May 28, 1889, Bessie Moncrieff stood trial before a jury of 12 men. The indictment named 2 charges. The first for stealing 10 shillings from a woman named Jane Maloud. The second for assaulting Georgina Graham, a female searcher employed at Rochester Row Police Station. In the courtroom that day, she looked different. A tall, handsome woman, about 30, one paper wrote, fashionably dressed. The words are strange to read after so many years of degradation. Perhaps she had borrowed the clothing. Perhaps she wanted to remind herself and the world that she was more than a headline. The evidence against her was brief but damning. The stolen coins were found in her possession. The assault on the searcher, a woman whose task was to examine female prisoners before admission to the cells, was described as deliberate and violent. Bessie, in her defense, spoke plainly. She said the money was her own, that she had never in her life stolen even a needleful of cotton. She admitted her many convictions for drunkenness, but insisted she had never committed a felony. Her words are remarkable in their precision, their weary dignity. "During the 17 years I have been in London," she told the court, "I have never been convicted of theft." That statement alone, preserved in the record, gives her back a trace of agency, a small assertion of honesty within a life of chaos. But the jury did not believe her. After a short deliberation, they found her guilty on both counts. The judge, Mr. Fletcher, reviewed her record. 30-odd convictions proved, and passed sentence: 4 months hard labor for the theft and 2 months for the assault to run consecutively, 6 months in all. When she heard the verdict, she turned to the jury and said almost gently, "I hope you'll sleep well in your beds after finding an innocent woman guilty. I can do that, and more easily." Then she bowed her head and was led away. That exchange, printed verbatim in the Daily Telegraph, marks the end of her first decade in the public record and the beginning of another, darker one. The cycle of drunkenness and disorder had hardened into a pattern of violence and institutionalization. The courts, having exhausted their limited compassion, now turned to confinement as the only answer. In prison, she would have worked the crank, a heavy iron handle that turned a weighted drum, or the treadwheel, climbing endless wooden steps that went nowhere. For women, these tasks were both punishment and humiliation, reminders that physical endurance could not redeem moral failure. Yet even in those places, she remained a spectacle. Jailers wrote of her unruly temper, her language beyond all bounds, her refusal to sit still or obey. When she emerged months later, she was no longer merely notorious. She was infamous, a living symbol of what reformers called the failure of female reclamation. In November 1889, only weeks after her release, her name appeared again in the press under the headline, "A Terrible Woman." The story described how, at 1:45 in the morning, she had approached a gentleman in Knightsbridge, taken his arm, and when he pulled away, smashed his hat over his eyes, saying, "Take that! I am Bessie Moncrieff." When arrested, she struck the constable in the mouth so hard that it bled. In court, she claimed she had only just been released from Hanwell Asylum, where she had been held for 8 months, and that she had spent time before that in Banstead and Broadmoor. Whether the chronology is accurate is uncertain, but her knowledge of those institutions suggests that she had indeed been through their doors. Each was part of the expanding network of asylums and reformatory prisons that now received the habitual and the incorrigible. The magistrate that day, Mr. Danecourt, was blunt. "You are indeed a terrible woman," he told her, "and I should not be surprised if you end your days in an asylum." She laughed. "Ah, well," she said, "I can do 6 weeks on my head." It is one of the last truly defiant lines attributed to her. After that, her sentences would lengthen, and her speech would grow less coherent, more weary. The newspapers would record her words less often. The woman who once declared herself by name, "I am Bessie Moncrieff," was slowly vanishing into the system that defined her. Yet even then, there are glimpses of something irrepressible: the wit, the self-awareness, the refusal to disappear quietly. The same fire that made her impossible to reform also made her unforgettable. By the close of 1889, she was 31, and the line between criminal and patient had begun to blur. London's machinery of order no longer knew what to do with her. The next chapter of her life would unfold not in the dock, but behind the walls of asylums, places meant for healing, yet haunted by punishment. The woman who had defied the city for nearly a decade was about to be claimed by it completely. And as the new decade opened, the question that had once defined her, what to do with Bessie Moncrieff, would give way to another: how to contain her mind. When the iron gates of Millbank Prison closed behind her for the last time in 1889, Bessie Moncrieff disappeared from the city that had both condemned and defined her. For the first time, she was not being held merely as a drunkard or a disturber of the peace. She was now a woman whose mind itself was considered suspect. The line between vice and illness, so clear to the Victorian courts, had begun to blur. In the surviving reports from that winter, she speaks almost like someone coming apart. She tells one magistrate she has been in 3 asylums: Banstead, Broadmoor, and Hanwell. Her voice is recorded in fragments, each phrase carrying the rhythm of exhaustion. "I was sent to Banstead, and from there to Broadmoor, and there to Hanwell," she says, as if trying to trace her own path through a maze. The reporter adds, "This suggests a series of transfers between institutions." Even in print, her sentence trails off. No full stop, only ellipses. The system that held her was designed for order, not understanding. Banstead Asylum in Surrey was one of several overflow hospitals for the mentally ill of London's poor. It housed nearly 2,000 patients, most committed through parish or police recommendation. Broadmoor, by contrast, was the criminal lunatic asylum, a fortress of red brick set among Berkshire hills. It was meant for those whose crimes were inseparable from madness, the unfit to plead, the dangerous to release. Hanwell, older still, was the archetype of the county asylum: workrooms, airing yards, and corridors so long they seemed to fold the horizon. It is impossible to know how long Bessie stayed in each. The institutions themselves rarely kept consistent files on women of her class, and her multiple aliases, Moncrieff, 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 scattered her records across jurisdictions. But her claim to have passed through all 3 feels true in essence, if not chronology. It captures the pattern of her life: confinement, movement, confinement again. The geography of her story was now made of walls. Inside those walls, the rituals of reform took on the stillness of religion. Days began at 6. Breakfast was bread and weak tea. Work was compulsory. Laundry, sewing, mending. Conversations were monitored. The air smelled of soap and coal. To the reformers, this monotony was therapeutic, the cure for disorderly women, but to the inmates, it was another kind of punishment. When Bessie told the court she had gone without drink for 8 months because she had been in prison and in 3 different asylums, she was not exaggerating. Sobriety for her was enforced, not chosen. Even the kindness she received was institutional. A clean blanket, a cup of broth, a nurse's hand on her shoulder. No one asked what drove her to such extremes. They simply named the result mania, delirium tremens, moral insanity. The Victorians used those phrases with confidence, convinced they were mapping the mind. They saw drunken women as a category of mental defect, an epidemic of female weakness that threatened the moral order of the nation. Reformers like Mary Carpenter and Sarah Robinson wrote of women enslaved to intemperance and called for asylums where they could be separated from temptation. The logic was almost comforting in its simplicity. Remove the woman from the world, and the world would be saved from her. But behind those ideals were real bodies, real lives, each one like Bessie's, too complex to fit the theory. The same reports that called her violent also described her as of fair complexion, blue-eyed, and of proportionate build. The juxtaposition is startling. An official portrait of calm beneath headlines of rage. Perhaps that is why her case so fascinated the press. She did not look like what society imagined a criminal woman should be. She blurred every boundary they depended on. During her stay in Hanwell, she would have been subjected to the standard routine for inebriate lunatics. Cold baths, religious instruction, endless labor. The asylum chaplain would have read scripture in the mornings, while attendants led the patients to walk in pairs around the airing yards. In the evenings, the women sat in silence, sewing under gaslight. For a few, the monotony soothed. For others, it deepened the fracture between the world inside and the memory of freedom outside. Bessie's memory of freedom was already fading. When she reappeared in court the following June 1890, arrested again after a violent scene in Hyde Park, she no longer mentioned Cornwall or home. Instead, she spoke of insult and provocation, claiming a policeman had called her a prostitute. The details of that night are chaotic. She accosted male riders near Rotten Row, swore at the officers, tore her own clothes, was carried to the station on a wheeled stretcher. The ambulance, as they called it. In court before Mr. Cook, she erupted once more, shouting at the constable, throwing her hat across the dock, challenging him to fight her. When he recounted her insults, she interrupted, "He called my friend names, and I would not bear it." The magistrate fined her 7 shillings. She glared, clenched her fists, and spat her final threat. "I'll make you pay 7 shillings more, you brute." That outburst, printed the next day, reads almost like a confession of futility. After months of silence behind asylum walls, she was back in the world, and the only language left to her was defiance. The newspapers, now accustomed to her violence, barely lingered. But one line stands out. Her previous visits to this court are many. The phrase carries a bureaucratic coldness that only repetition can produce. The reporters had stopped counting. When the cell door closed behind her that night, she must have known what awaited. Another short sentence, another file, another slow drift toward confinement. The reformers would call it habitual behavior. We might call it despair made visible. In the history of Victorian punishment, women like Bessie fall through the cracks. Too sane for the asylum, too unstable for the streets. Their suffering was administrative. They were moved, processed, recorded, and forgotten. And yet, in the few sentences that survive, her own voice quoted in court or scribbled by journalists, we still hear her struggle to name herself. "I am quite worried enough now," she had once told a constable. "Everyone takes advantage of me." These were not the words of madness, but of exhaustion. By the summer of 1890, her story had come full circle. From the laughter of the court to the silence of the cell, from the promise of rescue to the monotony of restraint. Each institution that claimed to cure her simply added another wall, but walls can only hold the body. The spirit, even wounded, looks for a way out. In the years that followed, she would find new ways to defy. Small gestures of rebellion against the unbreakable order. The woman who once struck a constable in open court would soon challenge the law itself, not through violence, but through the simple act of refusing to repent. By the autumn of 1890, the city had begun to treat her name like an echo. The laughter that once greeted her outbursts had thinned into weariness. Even the magistrates no longer tried to reform her. They simply asked, "How long since she was last here?" and filled in the blank. The experiment of mercy, remand, chaplain, rescue had been replaced by a bureaucratic rhythm of fines and sentences. It was in that year that the label took hold, habitual drunkard. The phrase sounded clinical, almost merciful, but it was another form of imprisonment, an identity imposed by law. The Habitual Drunkards Act of 1879 and later its amendments allowed the state to confine anyone who repeatedly appeared in court for intoxication. A woman who accepted such confinement could be held in a licensed home for reform. One who refused could be prosecuted under the Vagrancy Act as an incorrigible rogue. Bessie would eventually face both. In September 1890, the newspapers found her again. The charge was familiar: drunk and using obscene language in Sloane Street. The details are a blur: midnight, a police whistle, neighbors leaning from windows. In court before Mr. Dinecourt, she was at her most theatrical. When the assistant jailer stated she had been before the court 38 times, she shouted, "Make it 60!" The reporters caught the line gleefully. It filled the next day's headlines. Then she shrieked at the magistrate, "I'm cursed with Rochester Row Station. I can't keep away. Send me to prison again." The outburst stunned even the cynical crowd. It was confession and challenge at once. A woman demanding the punishment that society promised would save her. Mr. Dinecourt, who had once called her a terrible woman, did exactly that. He sent her back to prison. From there, her path wound steadily downward. The next year brought new charges: disturbances in Raphael Street, Knightsbridge, quarrels in Notting Hill, assaults on constables who tried to quiet her. The records grow shorter, their tone more mechanical. One report from June 1892 preserves a flicker of her old eloquence. Standing before Mr. Dutson at Westminster, she tried once more to bargain with fate. "Well, sir, I only came out of prison on Saturday. I had a glass or two after coming out from my 14 days, and it took effect on me. If you will be as lenient as possible, I will promise faithfully to go right out of London." The magistrate's answer was cold. "The only kindness to people like you is to keep you where you cannot get drunk." A woman from the Salvation Army standing near the dock offered a way out. If Bessie would sign a declaration under the Habitual Drunkards Act, giving the home authority to detain her, they would receive her that very day. It was the same offer she had refused before: freedom exchanged for control. "What?" she cried, her voice rising above the murmur of the court. "I decline everything. What next would you like?" The magistrate sighed. Another month of hard labor. In that refusal lies the essence of her tragedy. The system offered her two kinds of captivity, moral or penal. To accept the first was to surrender autonomy. To accept the second was to repeat the pattern she knew. Either way, the outcome was the same: walls. By 1892, journalists described her as a woman of violent habits, well known to every constable in Westminster. Some claimed she had been imprisoned 100 times, others said 50. Numbers no longer mattered. She was no longer judged for single acts, but for being herself. Her very presence on a street was considered provocation. That summer, she appeared again at Westminster Police Court, charged with using violent language. When a gentleman who had been with her offered to pay her cab fare home, she refused. In the dock, she was still proud, almost courteous, saying, "I had a glass or two, sir. I won't deny it." But when the offer of yet another rescue home arose and the same condition was read, that she must sign away her liberty, the transformation was instant. Her voice, the reporters noted, changed from soft to furious. "I will decline everything," she said again, word for word, as if the phrase itself were armor. To the Victorian reader, that refusal confirmed her hopelessness. To us, it sounds like the last defense of selfhood left to her. The courts had begun to speak of her in the collective language of reform. They said she ought to be placed in a certified reformatory, was beyond ordinary control, should be removed from temptation. Each phrase placed the burden of her suffering on morality rather than circumstance. Drink was not seen as illness, poverty not as cause, loneliness not as pain, only sin, habit, and defiance. Her own words tell another story. "Everyone takes advantage of me," she once said. "I have been driven to drink by a man." The statement is small, almost lost among the formal testimony, but it feels truer than anything else written about her. By the close of 1892, the phrase "incorrigible rogue" began appearing beside her name. It was the legal term for the repeat offender who could no longer be fined or reformed. Under the Vagrancy Act, she could now be sent to the quarter sessions, a higher court, for sentence as a danger to the public peace. When that order finally came, her reaction was printed in papers from London to Aberdeen. Standing in the dock, she shouted across the courtroom, "I am in the habit of getting drunk, and I glory in it. If I could get 4 bottles of brandy, I would drink the lot and settle myself this very day. I don't care what I do." The courtroom fell silent. The Star newspaper wrote, "There would be some sense in this committal if the chairman of the sessions kept a lunatic asylum." It was a bitter jest, but it caught the truth. The machinery of law had no place for her except the asylum or the cell. When she was led away, perhaps she looked once more toward the courthouse window. Outside, the rain was falling softly on the flagstones of Great Smith Street. Somewhere beyond the noise of the cab wheels lay the river, dark and indifferent. The city had swallowed her long ago, yet it continued to judge her for not finding a way out. To the officials, she was an habitual drunkard. To the moralists, a lesson. But in the small pauses between sentences, in the moments when she sat alone in her cell or stared at the water stains on the wall, she was simply a human being trying to survive the emptiness that followed every release. In the next chapter, the century itself will turn. The old prisons will give way to reformatories, and the law will find a new name for women like her, inebriates. But the pattern will not change. The state will still confuse control with care, and Bessie Moncrieff will still resist both. The rain that fell on London that evening seemed never to stop. By the time Bessie Moncrieff next appeared in court, the seasons had turned, but little else had changed. She moved through the 1890s as if through a revolving door, out, in, out again, her life measured by the rhythm of boots on the courthouse floor. To read the newspapers of those years is to feel the repetition, a slow erosion of individuality. Each story begins with her name and ends with her sentence, as predictable as the tolling of church bells. The decade opened with exhaustion, hers and everyone else's. For the magistrates, she was an administrative burden. For the constables, a nuisance. For the reporters, a ready column inch. Yet she persisted, appearing in print with the regularity of the weather. The tone of the coverage shifted. The laughter that had once colored her trials was gone. What remained was a kind of weary fascination, the sense of watching someone walk the same worn path until the earth itself gave way beneath her feet. In October 1894, the Chelsea News reported another familiar headline, "A notorious woman in trouble again." The details were small but vivid. She'd been found in Hasker Street, Chelsea, late at night, banging on the door of a house whose occupant she believed had once accused her of theft. The constable who arrested her said she shouted threats, then collapsed in tears. In court, Mr. Shiel presided. His judgment was neither cruel nor merciful, simply procedural. 1 month's hard labor, followed by an additional 3 months if she failed to find surety for good behavior for 6 months. The word surety belonged to the delicate grammar of Victorian justice. It meant that a respectable person could deposit money, a guarantee of the prisoner's reform. If she kept the peace, the sum would be returned. If not, it was forfeited, and she served the time instead. For a woman like Bessie, who had no family left in London and no friends willing to stand bail, it was a sentence without hope. The law, in its quiet way, knew that. It was a tidy mechanism for keeping her inside longer without admitting defeat. She clung to the dock when the sentence was read. The newspapers describe her being dragged away, screaming and cursing. Outside, the city continued its ordinary afternoon. In the pubs of Chelsea, men talked of football scores and politics. In the tenements of Pimlico, women boiled laundry. Only in the narrow corridor behind the courtroom did one hear her voice, echoing against stone. By February 1895, she was back again. This time, the venue was the West London Police Court, the charge the same, drunk and disorderly. The constable, Sergeant Daniels, testified that she had been found in Pembridge Square, Kensington, shouting at no one in particular. She had, he said, just come out of prison after serving 4 months. That detail tells the whole story. The 4 months correspond precisely to the sentence imposed in October, the month for hard labor, and the 3 in default of finding surety. The system had kept its promise. For the new offense, Mr. Rose, the magistrate, sentenced her to another 7 days. It was an almost meaningless punishment, a gesture to procedure rather than justice. By now, her prison record must have read like a directory of London's carceral geography. Millbank, Westminster, Marylebone, Holloway. She knew each by the sound of its locks. In the reports of these years, her language grows quieter. There are fewer outbursts, fewer grand defenses. Perhaps she was simply tired, or perhaps the reporters, too, had grown tired of transcribing her words. One article notes that she stood with head bowed, answering the magistrate in a low voice. Another, from 1895, says, the prisoner made no reply. Silence, once her enemy, had become her only refuge. That autumn, she returned to court yet again. The same court, the same magistrate, the same charge. The paper called it a hopeless case. She'd been released on a Friday. By Sunday night, she was drunk in Knightsbridge, arrested by the same officer who had testified against her before. The record reads like parody. The prisoner expressed contrition and was remanded. Yet even that word, remanded, had lost meaning. It was a pause between sentences, not a reprieve. In August 1896, the cycle reached its cruelest repetition. Once more, she stood before Mr. Dutson at Westminster, the same man who had offered her the Salvation Army's help 4 years earlier. The courtroom scene unfolded almost identically. A representative from the Army, this time a woman in bonnet and veil, offered her a place in Mrs. Booth's home. The condition, again, was that she must be bound over under the Habitual Drunkards Act, giving the institution the right to detain her. Her first response was weary acceptance. "I suppose I shall have to go," she said, "and see what it is like." But when the clerk read aloud the clause that gave the home legal power to hold her against her will, her temper flared as if a spark had struck dry tinder. "What?" she cried. "I will decline everything." The echo of those words, identical to her earlier refusal, moved through the courtroom like a ghost. The magistrate sighed, the reporters wrote. The sentence was read, 1 month's hard labor. As she was led away, she turned toward the missionary who had spoken kindly to her and shouted insults so fierce the paper could not print them. That moment, more than any other, captures the futility of her struggle. She could not accept kindness if it came with conditions. The system could not offer kindness without them. Between those two certainties lay her life. Outside, the world was changing. The final years of the century brought electric light, motor cars, telephones, inventions that promised progress. Yet inside the courts of Westminster, time seemed frozen. The same magistrates sat at the same benches, the same constables gave the same testimony, and at the center of it all, still spinning in the slow machinery of justice, was Bessie Moncrieff. By 1897, her age was listed as 39. The arithmetic no longer mattered. It was enough to say she was growing old. The woman who once shattered windows with her fists now appeared smaller, thinner, her sentences shorter, her fines higher. The newspapers began to call her a confirmed inebriate, a phrase that carried both pity and dismissal. One magistrate, after a long hearing, admitted defeat. "I am bewildered," he said. "I do not know what to do with you." Then, almost kindly, he added, "Go away and take your chance, but please do not come here again." Of course she would, and when she did, the world would have a new name for her condition. Not drunkenness, not disorder, but disease. The law was about to discover compassion through classification. In the next chapter, the century will turn, and with it, the vocabulary of punishment. The new Inebriates Act will promise reform instead of retribution. Yet for Bessie Moncrieff, it will mean the same as all the others. Another institution, another locked door, another long walk through corridors that smell of iron and soap. When the new century dawned, it did not feel new. The streets of London were the same, rain-polished, restless, alive with voices. But for Bessie Moncrieff, the world had changed in one small but decisive way. The law now had a different name for her. The Inebriates Act of 1898 had given magistrates the power to send habitual drunkards, especially women, to long-term reformatories rather than ordinary prisons. It was presented as an act of mercy, a medical answer to a moral problem. Under this new order, a woman like Bessie would no longer be sentenced to hard labor for a week or a month. She could be confined for years, for her own good. The state would care for her, study her, attempt to cure her. It sounded like progress, but to those who lived it, the change was mostly linguistic. A prison by any other name was still a cage. At the turn of 1899, Bessie was still wandering between Chelsea and Marylebone, her address always shifting, her age now guessed at 40. The papers had stopped describing her as good-looking. Instead, they called her a confirmed inebriate, a term that reduced a whole person to a single condition. 2 reports from that winter in the Marylebone Mercury capture her situation with terrible precision. In the first, she was charged with smashing a glass panel at the Coachmaker's Arms, a public house on Marylebone Lane. The landlord testified that she had been refused service. "If I cannot have drink," she said, "I will have revenge." Then she lifted her umbrella and struck the window until it splintered. The damage was estimated at £2, the equivalent of a month's wages for a working woman. In court, Mr. Plowden, the magistrate, regarded her with a weary amusement. "Revenge," he said, "may be sweet, but it is expensive." He fined her £2 or a month's imprisonment. She could not pay, and so the door closed again. The second report appeared only weeks later. This time the headline read, "A Bewildered Magistrate." Bessie had been brought up once more for drunkenness. The clerk noted that there was no room for her in any inebriate home. She stood in the dock, thin, unkempt, pleading to be sent to Cornwall. "My native place." The missionary who often spoke on her behalf reminded the court that she had indeed been sent there once before, but had destroyed her parents' property and come back to London. "Then what am I to do with her?" Plowden asked aloud. No one answered. The missionary could only shrug. Bessie, still defiant, declared that she had been to Port Said since... An absurd claim, perhaps. or simply an attempt to imagine escape? The magistrate replied with dry humor, "I wish you were there now." Then he sighed, defeated. "Go away and take your chance," he said, "but please don't come here again." And with that, he discharged her. It was not an act of mercy, but of resignation. Even the machinery of law had grown tired. The record from those months feels like the fading of a voice. The city that once shouted her name now barely murmured it. Other scandals filled the columns: Boer War reports, royal ceremonies, the new century's inventions. Yet in a small office at Scotland Yard, her name was entered again into a new kind of register, the official police description book for women convicted of repeated offenses. The entry dated 24th January 1903 lists her age as 45, implying a birth year of about 1858, the same date we have followed all along. It gives her height, 5 feet 1 inch. Her build, proportionate. Hair, fair. Eyes, blue. Complexion, fair. Marks, scars beneath the left eye and on the left side of the neck. Occupation, prostitute. Address, no fixed abode. Reading that entry is like looking at a photograph drawn in words. After decades of movement and myth, here is the most exact record of her existence, the body behind the reputation. It is strangely intimate in its bureaucracy, the state's final attempt to pin her to the page. It notes, too, that she frequents the Marble Arch district, the heart of her old territory. For nearly 20 years, the same few streets had contained her life: Piccadilly, Knightsbridge, Sloane Street, Marylebone Lane, Hyde Park Corner. She had become part of the geography, as familiar as the cabmen who waited by the curbs. That same year, 1903, saw the first use of the new law in her case. The magistrate at West London Court ordered her detention in a reformatory under the Inebriates Act. But even the reformatories hesitated. The official note reads that the authorities of the ordinary homes refused to have anything to do with her, owing to her bad character. She was, in effect, too troublesome for mercy. Only one institution agreed to take her, the South Counties Inebriate Reformatory at Lewes, in Sussex. The London Police News, reporting on the order, described her as 45 years of age, with over 200 convictions. The number was almost certainly exaggerated, but by then exaggeration was part of her myth. The article added one last curious detail, that she claimed to be the wife of an ex-member of Parliament and captain in the army. No proof was offered. It was printed simply as a line of dialogue, a glimpse of imagination breaking through the monotony of punishment. Perhaps she had once known such a man. Perhaps she invented him to remind herself that she had once been loved. Whatever truth lay behind the story, the magistrate ignored it. The order was signed. She was sent to Lewes for indefinite confinement. The South Counties Reformatory was not a prison in name, but its walls were high and its windows barred. Women sent there under the act were expected to work, pray, and abstain. The schedule was strict. Silence was a virtue. They were taught domestic skills in hopes of release into service, though few ever found employment again. The state recorded them as reformed when they ceased to resist. In that quiet countryside institution, Bessie would spend the first years of the new century. She had once been London's noise, shouting in streets, singing in pubs, defying constables. Now she was silence itself, a file number among hundreds of others. Perhaps she stood sometimes by the barred window and looked toward the downs, the hills rolling toward the sea. The landscape might have reminded her of Cornwall, though she had not seen it for more than 20 years. It is comforting to imagine that she found some moment of peace there. A morning of sunlight through the fog, a cup of tea shared without judgment, a brief absence of noise. When her name next surfaced, it was 1908. Another police register confirmed her identity, the same scars, the same fair hair. The record stated that she had been sentenced at the Middlesex Sessions to 3 days imprisonment and 3 years in a certified inebriate reformatory. 3 years, the longest confinement of her life. The law had at last achieved what the city had sought for decades: silence. And yet, when those 3 years ended, she would return again to the streets of London, smaller, older, but still herself. The woman whom pity and punishment could not change. When the gates of the South County's inebriate reformatory finally opened, the woman who stepped out was no longer the furious figure who had once shattered pub windows or defied magistrates in open court. Time had done what the law could not. It had quieted her. Whether she left in 1911 or 1912 is uncertain. The official record of her discharge has not survived. But the trail she left in the newspapers tells us that by the closing months of 1912, Bessie Moncrieff had returned to London. The reformatory had been her longest sentence, 3 years under the Act, part of a system that treated abstinence as salvation. Each day at Lewis followed the same rhythm: prayer at dawn, work until evening, instruction in female propriety. The women washed linen, scrubbed floors, stitched coarse garments for the state. They were called patients rather than prisoners, but the key difference was only vocabulary. The barbed wire that enclosed the exercise yard was meant for the protection of their souls. By the time Bessie emerged, she was nearly 50. The city she returned to was no longer the one she had haunted in her youth. The hansom cabs were being replaced by motor cars. Electric lights burned where gas lamps once glowed. The streets where she had fought constables were now crowded with department stores and the first buses. The familiar corners of Piccadilly and Knightsbridge were still there, but the people had changed. London was younger, faster, and less patient with the relics of its Victorian past. Still, she drifted back to the same territory. Edgware Road, Harrow Road, the rough arteries that led north from Marble Arch. To the constables of that district, she was an old name, almost a ghost from another era. The arrest reports of the early 1910s record her like a faint echo. Elizabeth Moncrieff, 47, of no fixed abode, charged with being drunk and disorderly. The wording had not changed in 30 years. Only the adjectives had softened. No longer violent, now incapable. Her last recorded serious offense before the Great War came in December 1912. The scene was Sirdar Road, North Kensington, in the early hours of Sunday morning. A constable, P.C. Rawlins, heard her shouting and knocking on doors, demanding to be let into a lodging house. When he told her to be quiet, she spat in his face and tried to strike him with a hatpin. At the West London Police Court, the magistrate Mr. Garrett asked her age. 47. She said. The court fined her 40 shillings, or 1 month in prison. The line between pity and punishment had grown thin. Even the newspapers, once so eager to display her temper, now treated her as a curiosity. A survival from the days of the horse omnibus and the lamplighter. One paper described her as an elderly woman with worn features and a trembling hand. The violence had drained away, leaving only persistence. If she served the month, she would have been released in January 1913, just before the winter of London's great social tensions: strikes, suffragette marches, and hunger demonstrations. We do not know where she went. No census lists her name. No reformatory log records her transfer. Perhaps she spent nights in the workhouse wards along Notting Hill or Paddington, where women could buy a bed for a few pence. Perhaps she lingered near the shelters run by the Church Army or the new Roten houses for destitute women. The institutions that had once claimed to save her were now full of others. The Inebriates Act itself was beginning to fade, its promise of rehabilitation through detention quietly abandoned as ineffective. The reformatories closed one by one. The state moved on to other experiments. But Bessie remained, walking the same streets that had formed the map of her existence. There is a small, strange comfort in knowing she endured. To survive at all in that world required a kind of stubborn vitality. For every headline that called her terrible, there must have been nights when she simply sat in a doorway, watching the lights of the city she could not leave. The next glimpse we have of her comes 10 years later, in June 1922. The Yorkshire Evening Post carried a short notice, a fragment among the day's news of coal strikes and royal tours. It read, "Bessie Moncrieff, age 60, with about 70 convictions against her, was sent to prison for 1 month with hard labor for being found drunk in Hyde Park." The constable testified that she and 2 companions had been drinking methylated spirits, industrial alcohol, colored purple, and sold for pennies. It was the drink of last resort, common among those who had nothing left to pawn. The report is brief, but its imagery lingers. Hyde Park in summer, the grass brittle with heat, the air filled with the sound of traffic from Park Lane. Somewhere near the trees, a small group of old women sat on the grass, laughing or crying, the bottle passing between them. When the police arrived, she was too weak to stand, 60 years old and still drinking beneath the same sky that had once watched her as a girl of 25 on the steps of the Yorkshire Grey. No one in court mentioned her past. The name that had once filled columns was now only a whisper. Even her age, 60, might have been a guess. The laughter of her youth had become a kind of mercy, the silence of her old age, a disappearance. Her last known appearance came 3 years later, in October 1925. The Daily Mirror printed a brief notice. Bessie Moncrieff, aged 57, of no fixed abode, was fined $1 at Marlborough Street Police Court for being drunk and incapable. The number of convictions was said to be 400. The figure was almost certainly invented, but its exaggeration reveals something deeper, that her life had become legend, an urban myth of incorrigibility. To the reporters, she was no longer a person but a symbol, the woman who could not be cured. After that, the record ends. No burial register has been found under her name. No death certificate conclusively matches her. She vanishes, as so many of her kind did, into the silence of the city. Perhaps dying in a workhouse infirmary, perhaps on a bench in some fog-dimmed street near Marble Arch. The official story closes there, but the human one continues in imagination. What remained of her in those final years? The scars beneath her eye, perhaps faded to pale threads, the trace of Cornish vowels in her voice, the stubborn pulse of a life that refused to end neatly. The system had done all it could, prisons, asylums, reformatories, sermons, and she had outlived them all. She had become, in a quiet, inadvertent way, one of the last witnesses of the Victorian underclass. The forgotten women who walked between charity and punishment, who were spoken of as pests, but were, in truth, the casualties of loneliness. As the century grew louder with progress, she disappeared into its quietest corners. But the record, a handful of court transcripts, a police ledger, a few lines in old newspapers, keeps her there still, a faint figure in the city's memory. And as the night deepened over London, one could imagine her walking once more beneath the lamps of Hyde Park, the air heavy with mist, her breath slow, her steps uncertain. She had survived what others could not. In that endurance, however bitter, there was something almost heroic, a life that, even at its smallest, refused to vanish completely. The fog moves through London differently now. The sound of hooves has faded, replaced by the hum of motor cars, but the air over Marble Arch still carries its familiar chill. If one stands there in the small hours, when the buses have gone and the lamps burn low, it is possible to imagine her figure passing again along Edgware Road, slight, fair-haired, wrapped in a shawl, walking as though she could not stop. For a moment the past becomes visible, then dissolves again into the dark. By the 1920s, the city that had created her also forgot her. The files that recorded her hundreds of charges were quietly moved to archives, their ink fading to brown. The constables who once cursed her retired, the magistrates who sentenced her died, the newspapers that ridiculed her wrapped fish in the markets of Soho, yet her name lingered, strangely weightless, among the anecdotes of police court lore. "Bessie Moncrieff," they said. the woman who could not be reformed. What does it mean to be remembered for defiance? To live so long in resistance that even history gives up trying to explain you? In the language of her time, she was a habitual offender, an inebriate, a pest. But behind each label lies the story of an ordinary human need: to be seen, to be heard, to escape pain. The records that define her speak of drunkenness, but not of why she drank. They describe violence, but not the loneliness that fueled it. They measure her years in convictions, but not in the empty hours between them. Every decade found a new word for what she was. In the 1880s, she was a disorderly woman. In the 1890s, an incorrigible rogue. By 1904, an inebriate. Each term was meant to capture her, but none could. The vocabulary of reform shifted, yet the reality remained. A woman in distress, confronted by systems that could only confine. For the Victorians, the solution to suffering was order. They built prisons, asylums, and refuges in the belief that structure could heal. But order cannot cure despair. It can only contain it. In that containment, something fragile is lost: the small human chance to understand. Bessie's story is not singular. She belonged to a whole generation of working-class women whose grief took the form of public disorder. They shouted in the streets because they had nowhere private to weep. The idea of the fallen woman, so beloved of the 19th century, offered little comfort. It assumed a moral descent from purity to ruin, a story that could be reversed only through repentance. But Bessie's life had no such neat trajectory. She did not fall. She was worn down, slowly, by the friction between survival and respectability. Each court appearance was less a fall than a continuation of the same motion, a life circling the same few miles of pavement, the same few cells, the same small mercy of being alive. Even in her decline, there was a kind of clarity. She had become what the newspapers once called a byword in the West End. But a byword is not a life. It is a mirror that society holds up to itself. Her notoriety served a purpose. She was the visible warning of invisible misery. The respectable classes could read about her at breakfast and feel reassured that their own lives were safely distant from such chaos. Yet the line between them was thinner than they imagined. The files of the Metropolitan Police tell us that she was of proportionate build, that her eyes were blue, that her voice was gentle when sober. These details matter. They bring her closer, stripping away the caricature of the terrible woman. It is possible to picture her sitting quietly at a station bench, her hands folded, her head lowered. The constables who described her as violent also noted her moments of calm, the mornings when she would speak softly or thank them for a cup of tea before sentencing. Such moments rarely made it to print. They did not fit the story the city wanted to tell. In many ways, Bessie's tragedy was not hers alone. She lived at the meeting point of two powerful Victorian contradictions: the belief in moral responsibility and the denial of social cause. The state preached that every person could choose virtue, yet provided almost no means to survive poverty without vice. For men, drink was a sin. For women, it was a disgrace. The difference lay not in behavior, but in visibility. A drunken man could recover his standing. A drunken woman became a spectacle. When we read the final fragments of her record, the fines, the short sentences, the note of no fixed abode, they no longer sound like punishment. They sound like routine. The courts had become part of her life, as predictable as the seasons. Perhaps that is the saddest transformation of all, the moment when resistance becomes repetition, when even rebellion follows a schedule. And yet there is something unyielding in her persistence. Through decades of incarceration, through the machinery of moral reform, she remained herself, a voice that refused to vanish into compliance. The system changed its names, but she never changed hers. She kept saying again and again, "I am Bessie Moncrieff." What remains now is not her guilt or her defiance, but her endurance. The quiet, stubborn human act of surviving within a society that could not forgive imperfection. To study her story is to look through the narrow window of one life and glimpse the vast, uneasy landscape of the Victorian conscience. In that sense, she did not fail at all. She exposed, without meaning to, the limits of the world that judged her. And somewhere, beyond the reach of records and reformatories, there must have been a moment, a morning, perhaps, after rain. When she woke in some small lodging room, the window opened to the sound of carriages and felt, for a few seconds, ungoverned. After her last recorded appearance in 1925, the city fell silent around her name. There are no more clippings, no more police ledgers, no more witnesses. The paper trail that had followed her for more than 40 years simply stops, as though London itself finally turned away. Somewhere, perhaps in a workhouse infirmary or a quiet cemetery, her story reached its end without ceremony. No obituary, no photograph, no grave with a name. Only absence, that most common conclusion for the poor. The silence that follows is almost gentle. For decades, she had lived within noise, the courtroom's echo, the jeers of bystanders, the clatter of cell doors. To imagine her final years is to imagine stillness, the noise of her existence finally absorbed by the vast, indifferent hum of the city. By then, she would have been in her 60s, her face marked by the life she had lived, her steps slower, her hands unsteady. And yet, in that quiet, there might have been a kind of peace. The world had stopped expecting anything from her. History rarely knows what to do with such endings. The official archives preserve birth certificates and coronations, not the slow fading of ordinary lives. The chroniclers of her century were not interested in how she died, only in how she disturbed the living. But perhaps that is why her story still lingers. Its incompleteness leaves space for reflection. Every person who appeared in the police courts of Victorian London left a trace. A single paragraph, a sentence, a name spelled differently each week. Most vanished after 1 or 2 entries. Only a few, like Bessie, returned so often that the record of punishment became the record of their life. We know her through the rhythm of those appearances: 1882, 1884, 1885, 1887, 1889, 1892, 1896, 1903, 1912, 1922, 1925, each date a small door opening briefly onto her world, then closing again. Between them lies the vast territory of what can never be known. Her laughter, her private fears, the sound of her voice when she was not shouting. It is tempting to see her only as a victim, and she was that. But she was also a witness to the limits of the society that judged her, to the gap between compassion and control. Through her, we glimpse the long shadow of Victorian morality extending into the modern age, the belief that disorder could be cured through discipline, that the poor could be redeemed by confinement. The truth, as her life quietly insists, is that suffering cannot be legislated away. When the Inebriates Act was first passed, reformers celebrated it as the dawn of a humane system. They imagined that by separating drunkards from temptation, they were rescuing them from ruin. But the statistics tell a different story. Most of the women sent to reformatories reoffended within months of release. Many, like Bessie, preferred the freedom of the streets to the suffocating gentility of charity. The system mistook control for care. It sought obedience rather than understanding, silence rather than healing. Bessie's resistance, viewed from a distance, looks almost philosophical. She refused to sign declarations that stripped her autonomy. She rejected homes that offered safety at the cost of freedom. To the magistrates, this seemed madness. To us, it reads as the fierce assertion of a woman who understood that surrendering her will, even for comfort, was a kind of death. She may not have known how to live well, but she knew what it meant to live on her own terms. In that way, she embodies the hidden heroism of survival, the endurance of those who refuse to disappear quietly into the categories assigned to them. The newspapers wanted a spectacle. The courts wanted repentance. She offered neither. What remains of her in the record is not contrition, but persistence. Sometimes, walking through London today, one catches a glimpse of her world preserved in architecture. The Vine Street police station, where her story began, still stands behind its pale brick facade. The narrow courts of Pimlico and Chelsea are quieter now, their public houses replaced by cafes and shops. The windows that once glowed with gaslight now shine with the soft yellow of electric lamps. Yet in these streets, the faint echo of her life remains, the woman who defied them all, whose footsteps wore the pavement smooth. It is strange to think that she outlived so many of those who condemned her. The magistrates, the constables, the missionaries, all gone long before her final appearance in 1925. Even the laws that defined her were repealed and forgotten. She survived not through triumph, but through endurance, an ordinary persistence that history rarely honors. What would she have made of the modern world that followed? The hospitals that finally treated alcoholism as illness rather than sin, the women's shelters that offered refuge without sermons, the psychologists who replaced chaplains. Would she have trusted them? Or would she have seen, behind the new language, the same old desire to correct the unmanageable? Perhaps she would have smiled and said, "I decline everything," as she had done all her life. Her silence after 1925 is not an erasure, but a return to the anonymity from which she first emerged. Every life, after all, ends in some form of quiet. But hers leaves behind a question that the city still carries, unspoken. How many other stories were buried beneath the sound of judgment? When the last of the court reporters laid down his pen, her name remained faintly inked between the lines of London's memory, not as a monster nor as a saint, but as a reminder that behind every case, every file, every statistic, there is a heartbeat that once refused to stop. And so the silence that followed her was not empty. It was the sound of a life finally unmeasured by law, uncounted by conviction, unjudged by anyone at all. There is a moment near dawn when London seems almost transparent. The noise stills, the lamps hum faintly, and the city's long memory seems to hover in the air, not as history, but as presence. Every life that ever passed through its streets is still there in some form, a trace in the pavement, a whisper in the architecture, a name pressed into paper. And among them, faint but persistent, is hers, Bessie Moncrieff, a name once shouted across courtrooms, now murmured in archives. For decades, she was a headline, a spectacle, a cautionary tale. Now she is a file, one of countless others stored in a drawer, her life reduced to half a dozen official phrases: no fixed abode, prostitute, fair hair, blue eyes, 5'1", proportionate build. The handwriting on her file is precise, almost tender, as though the clerk who wrote it sensed the weight of what was being recorded. Yet no amount of paperwork can contain a life. The words describe her, but they cannot capture her. They do not tell of her laughter or the way she might have hummed to herself walking down Sloane Street, or the sound of her voice when she said thank you after a sentencing that others found amusing. They do not tell of the warmth of her hand when she clutched the magistrate's letter from Cornwall, or the smell of the sea that might once have lingered on her childhood clothes. What remains of her is not the certainty of what happened, but the tenderness of what might have. Every society leaves behind people like her, the ones who do not fit its narrow definitions of virtue or usefulness, who refuse to be cured or corrected. The Victorians, for all their ambition, could not comprehend a woman like Bessie. To them, she was disorder made flesh, the failure of family, the embarrassment of reform. They could record her, they could punish her, they could even attempt to save her, but they could not imagine her complexity. She existed only in extremes, sinner or sufferer, criminal or victim, never as a whole person. To look back at her now, through the haze of time, is to see something entirely different. It is to see a woman living the only way she knew how, in a world that offered her nothing but judgment. Every act of defiance, every reckless insult hurled at authority becomes a form of survival. The prisons she endured, the asylums that claimed to treat her, the endless march through police courts, they were not simply punishments. They were evidence of her endurance, her refusal to vanish quietly into the anonymity expected of the poor. If her story feels endless, it is because the conditions that shaped it never truly ended. The architecture of her punishment, the moral courts, the conditional charities, the blurred line between care and control, lingers still, in different forms. The details have changed. The logic has not. And so her story becomes not only a fragment of the past, but a mirror for the present. The people who watched her in court could not have imagined that she would be remembered more than a century later. Not for her crimes, but for her humanity. Yet that is what remains. The woman they called a pest to the neighborhood has outlived them all in memory. Her life, written across the columns of forgotten newspapers, becomes something like a poem, a rhythm of struggle, silence, return. To speak her name now is to lift it gently out of the bureaucratic language that buried it. She was not merely a drunkard or a rogue or a patient. She was a person who once loved and was loved, who once stood beneath the same sky we see tonight. A woman who longed for home, but could not find her way back. In the end, what redeems her story is not tragedy, but recognition. When we read those reports, the magistrate's sigh, the constable's complaint, her own weary words, we recognize something of ourselves, the wish to be understood, the stubborn need to be free, the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, will remember us kindly. That, perhaps, is the hidden mercy of history. It forgets the sentences but remembers the names. And in the file marked Bessie Moncrieff, there remains the faint outline of a life that mattered. Not because it was exemplary, but because it was real. A life of mistakes and endurance, laughter and rage, sorrow and small mercies. A life lived in the open air of the city, in the shadows of its courts, beneath its indifferent stars. If we listen closely, we might still hear her walking through the streets just before dawn, the echo of her heels on the cobblestones, her voice steady, soft, unrepentant, carried on the wind. "I am quite worried enough now," she once said, half in jest, half in truth. It might have been her epitaph. There is something beautiful in that line, not sorrowful but human. It holds both the exhaustion of suffering and the faint, unbreakable spark of selfhood. And so we end where we began, a name, a city, and the endless attempt to understand how one life, so small, so troubled, so persistent, could contain such depth. Bessie Moncrieff, remembered now not for her crimes, but for her courage to exist in a world that never made room for her. Her story ends in silence, but not in oblivion. It remains, filed, fragile, and alive, waiting for someone to open the record, to read the lines aloud, and to see her once more as she truly was, a human being, imperfect and unforgotten.